join. So thanks everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us for today's Coyote information session. My name is Danny Glantz. I'm a farm policy analyst at the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. Part of my portfolio includes the wildlife file. So I'm joined here today by my colleague, Tom Lewis, industry relations specialist from Ontario Sheep Farmers, and Brent Patterson, senior research scientist, wildlife research and monitoring section for the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources, and Forestry.
Perfect, thanks, Danny. And before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules. As Danny's mentioned previously, while some of you were waiting, this session is being recorded and will be available to registrants afterwards. It will also be hosted on the OSF YouTube channel. We ask that you keep your microphones on mute and please keep your cameras off to preserve bandwidth, as Danny mentioned. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Certainly if we have time, please use the raise hand button located at the bottom of the screen to do so. We ask for you to be patient and wait until your name has been called before asking questions. And we want to take as many live ones if we can as possible to make today's presentation a little bit more interactive. You can also ask questions through the chat box. I will be monitoring those, and if we run out of time, we will do our best to try and answer any remaining questions, and we'll circulate those with the link to the recording. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Brent Patterson. Brent joined the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources as a scientist in research scientist in 2001 and has been a professor at Trent University since that time. His current research focuses on population dynamics of wolves, coyotes, and their prey in temperate and boreal regions. He has published extensively on wolves, coyotes, caribou, and moose in Ontario and beyond. Whether it be for work or for pleasure, he enjoys spending as much time as possible in the field. Brent will be discussing coyote ecology and providing an overview of coyote research his team has conducted in Ontario. And he will also be discussing the problem of livestock depredation by coyotes and provide advice on how to avoid conflicts with coyotes.
Great. Thanks very much, Tom. Is that my cue to launch in?
That is, and I'm going to keep looking at the waiting room. So if anyone gets booted, we will certainly bring you back in. Over to you, Brent.
Great. Yeah, well, thanks very much. I'm happy to be here today. I'm happy to have this chance to chat with you all about coyotes in Ontario and about some of the research that my team has been involved in with coyotes over the last couple decades. And we'll dive right in. So the first thing that people need to know about coyotes in Ontario is that they're not native. And when European colonizers first arrived in North America, coyotes had a much more restricted distribution on the continent than they do today. And it was largely restricted to the Central Plains area of the continent. And you know, there coyotes fed on primarily on small prey like mice and voles and hares and jackrabbits. There over millennia, there was some expansion made into the western part of the Great Lakes region, but generally speaking, their distribution prior to European contact is what was shown here in dark gray. When we landed here in North America, we cleared land for agriculture and for settlement, and we aggressively removed other large predators as well, including wolves and bears and cougars. And all these changes that humans made to the landscape paved the way for a massive range expansion by coyotes. So coyotes do much better even today in sort of disturbed, sort of fragmented rural landscapes than they do in continuous forest. And so coyotes really benefited from changes that we made to the landscape. And as you can see here as indicated by the light gray shading on this map, coyotes now occupy most of North America and well up into the Canadian Arctic, as well as Alaska and over into Labrador. In 1987, they made it across, by floating on some ice, made it across to Newfoundland. So yeah, coyotes are very widely distributed now. And this map just shows in a bit more detail some of the chronology of coyotes range expansion, the coyotes range expansion into eastern North America. But it also gives me the opportunity to highlight something important that happened that affects us here in Ontario. So the first coyote confirmed in Ontario was killed on the highway in Lambton County in 1919. And at that time, our eastern wolf populations had a bit of a broader distribution than they do today. And when those first coyotes showed up in Ontario early in the 20th century, they interbred with our eastern wolves. And as a consequence, all the coyotes that went on to colonize eastern Canada and the northeastern United States carried with them some wolf genetic material that they picked up here in Ontario as well as in southern Quebec. So this leads to the genetic identity of coyotes in Ontario today. We refer to our coyotes as eastern coyotes to reflect the fact that they all have some shared ancestry with wolves, although most of the genetic material in coyotes in Ontario is of coyote origin. In the media, you'll often hear people talk about coy wolves, and generally when people are talking about a coy wolf, it's just another term, I guess, that folks are using for the eastern coyote. And so we have done extensive genetic analysis on coyotes across Ontario, and when we look at the genetics of coyotes in southern Ontario and over in the Far East, say around Cornwall, and then as you move up through the Northwest, past Sault Ste. Marie and Wawa, and then we find that our coyotes are all very genetically similar, and that's not surprising given their high mobility. And I'll show you a few slides later on that just highlight how mobile coyotes are. So when you see how mobile they are, it makes sense that they don't have a lot of genetic isolation, I guess, and genetic distinctiveness, and it makes sense that they're part of one big population. So when people talk about a coy wolf, they're really just referring to the same eastern coyote that we see across much of southern and central Ontario. And yeah, it's the same old eastern coyote. So the next thing I would just comment on a bit before we dive into the meat of things is the size. So when western coyotes interbred with our eastern wolves back in the early 20th century, that did result in the eastern coyote being slightly larger than their western counterparts, but they're still, for the most part, much smaller than most people think. So when we talk to people about coyotes that they've seen, or people are reporting sightings, very often we'll hear people say, "Oh, it was as big as a German Shepherd," and unless they happen to own a particularly small German Shepherd, that's just simply, in most cases, not going to be true. So say a typical German Shepherd weighs in the 70 to 90 pound range. That's considerably larger than eastern coyotes. So here's a picture of a breeding pair of coyotes from Mississauga that we were studying a number of years ago. That's the breeding male in the background, the sort of blonde phase animal. He weighed about 40 pounds. And then his mate in the foreground with the radiocollar was much smaller. She only weighed 34 pounds. And yeah, even animals like this, when we talk to people that had photographed or seen these animals, and we would get the same reports that, oh, they're as big as a German Shepherd. And much of the overestimation of size, I think, comes from the fact that coyotes tend to have very thin frames. So a dog with a similar frame would typically weigh more, and for much of the year they have big bushy coats. So they do look bigger than they are, but they're really generally not very large animals. We've captured the odd one, and we get have trappers or hunters have submitted sometimes coyotes that are up into the 50 pound range or low 50s, but those are very rare. And most adult male coyotes in Ontario would rarely weigh much more than 40 pounds. The ministry also gets a lot of questions about coy dogs or potential coy dog hybrids. And in fact, when we, as I mentioned, we've done genetic analysis on a very large number of coyotes across the province. And we do find some dog DNA in our eastern coyotes. But for the most part, the dog DNA that we see in coyotes appears to have been picked up very early on in the colonization process, and maybe even on their way to Ontario rather than in Ontario. And there's a number of, you can imagine that in rural Ontario, there would be lots of opportunities perhaps for coyotes and dogs to interbreed, but we don't see a lot of contemporary evidence for this interbreeding, and we don't see a lot of dog DNA in coyotes, and there's a few good reasons for that. When it does occur, it tends to be a male coyote and a female dog, but the fertility of hybrids tends to be low. So the first generation cross, if you were able to take a male coyote and female dog and produce pups, which you could in captivity, the hybrids that are produced would be similar to mules, so it would have very low fertility. And if the hybrid females did come into season, they tend to do so about 2 months early. So what day is April 12th? Most coyote pups in southern Ontario and central Ontario are being born now and over the next couple of weeks. Sort of mid to late April is a common time. But if you're a coy dog hybrid, you would have come into season a couple months early, two estrus cycles early, and those pups would be born in February. So February, you can imagine, is a tough time to rear pups. Another big difference is that both coyotes and wolves, both members of the breeding pair share in the pup rearing duties. So we see both parents providing food and care to the pups, whereas male coy dog hybrids, they have no parental instinct. So here you've got a situation now where if you had a female coy dog, she's likely to be very infertile, so she's not likely to get pregnant in the first place. If she does become pregnant, she will likely birth the pups about 2 months early, so in February, and she's got no mate to help provide care for them. So all these things contribute to the fact that when coy dogs do occur in the wild in Ontario, they have very little chance of sort of persisting and passing on their genes. So when we talk about coyote social organization, people often talk about packs, but really the basic social unit of the coyote is the mated pair. And coyotes are monogamous, and a mated pair will stay together for several years, many years, if they both survive long enough. And a pack, what we refer to as a pack, really is just this breeding pair and their pups, from the most recent litter. And the big difference between a pack of coyotes and a pack of wolves is that coyotes mature at a younger age. So if you see 4 or 5 coyotes, in a field or somewhere like that, you're probably looking at the mated pair and their pups from the most recent litter, and pups that are less than a year old. Whereas with wolves, they mature at a older age, and so packs of wolves tend to be family groups as well. But it's more common for pups from several previous litters to still be present in a pack. So you might have pups that were born 2 years ago and pups that were born a year ago, and the parents together in a group of wolves. Howling is a common feature of coyotes, and I'm sure everybody here has heard it often. We often get people saying, or people saying, "Oh, every time I hear a coyote's howl, does that mean they're chasing deer or chasing something?" And that's not really the case. So howling primarily serves the function of keeping members of social groups in touch with each other, and also broadcasting occupancy of territory. So coyotes are territorial animals. I'll show you some maps in a few minutes to illustrate that. But like birds, they occupy an exclusive territory. And if you're going to occupy an exclusive territory, sometimes that'll involve a physical confrontation, with neighboring animals from neighboring social groups. And those physical confrontations can be very costly, very dangerous. So if you can broadcast occupancy of your territory through howling, and maybe even broadcast the size of your family, that's a more passive way of saying, we're here, we're going to defend this territory. And hopefully by doing that, they can avoid actually having physical confrontations or fights with the neighboring packs. There is some evidence that howling can be used to coordinate hunting activities sometimes, and I documented some of this when I studied coyotes and deer in Nova Scotia. We had a couple coyotes that were chasing a adult male white-tailed deer in the wintertime, and they seemed to be unable to get the deer down, and then they appeared to beckon their two pups in from about 500 meters away through howling, and then together the four animals were able to get the deer down. But that leads to an interesting question too. So a lot of people think then that coyotes form packs exclusively for the purpose of hunting large prey. And again, a pack is simply a family group. And interestingly, the conditions that lead to larger families of coyotes, so bigger group sizes, really is just more food overall. And what that does is it allows the pups to delay their dispersal from their parents' territory and to stay with the family longer. So when there's more food, pup survival tends to be higher, and the pups can stay in their natal family with their parents longer. So this means larger social groups or larger packs are able to form. But interestingly, it doesn't matter what form the food is in. So if there was a ton of snowshoe hares to eat and a lot of small mammals, you would see larger groups and groups that are more cohesive over time than you would in a case where the coyotes are living in an area where they might feed more on white-tailed deer, but there's less food overall. So really, group size and the timing of dispersal of pups from the packs they're born into is really tied to how much food there is rather than what that food is per se. So coyote life history, they're what we call monestrous, meaning the coyotes only come into heat one time a year, so they produce 1 litter a year. Breeding is typically occurs in February. Gestation period is similar to dogs, close to 9 weeks, and that means that, as I mentioned, some pups would be being born, as we speak now, and this will continue on through April and wrap up by early May. Litter sizes range typically from 3 to 9, but 6 is a pretty good average litter size for Ontario. And as I mentioned earlier, both parents share in the pup rearing duties. So they'll either bring small sort of manageable pieces of food back to the den to feed the pups when the pups are young, or more commonly they'll fill their bellies very full with food, come back to the den, and then the pups or other coyotes at the den lick around their mouth and elicit a regurgitation response, and they spit up the chewed food, and then the pups feed on that. And another difference between coyotes and wolves is that most coyote pups will disperse during their first autumn of life, and the vast majority of coyotes will disperse before their first birthday. When I mention dispersal, what I really mean is that they're leaving their parents' territory. So both with coyotes and wolves, if you want to reproduce and have pups of your own, chances are you're going to have to leave your parents' territory to do it. It's pretty rare with both species to see an animal inheriting a breeding position in the family group from one of their parents. So usually most animals that are going to reproduce in their lifetime will have to leave the territory they're born into to do that. So I've talked a lot about territories. These yellow polygons on this map of Prince Edward County just illustrate the territories of some radiocollared coyotes that we monitored in Prince Edward County. And here in this rural landscape, the average territory size was just under 15 square kilometers. We've also monitored radiocollared coyotes in the Greater Toronto area, and we've monitored coyotes up as we move up towards Parry Sound District and east of Georgian Bay. And typically what we see is as you go from south to north, productivity tends to decline and the size of a coyote territory gets larger. So I mentioned earlier that during their range expansion in North America, coyotes really benefited from the fragmentation and the forest clearing and things that we did. And you can really see that even within Ontario when you look at territory size. So again, here in an agricultural area, coyotes territories average about 14.5 square kilometers. If we looked at the average size of a territory in forested lands, say west of Algonquin Park over towards Parry Sound District, they tend to be 30, 40, 50 square kilometers. So in that continuous forest, which is less productive and has, you know, fewer small mammals and things, they require larger areas to feed themselves, so the density of coyotes then gets lower as you move from south to north. Here is just an atypical den of pups here. So this was actually on the Leslie Spit in Toronto, and here the coyotes actually denned in a big pile of slab concrete, and you know, actually it was a very good den because nothing really was going to be able to you know, dig them up here. This is a very safe and secure place for them to have that den. Anyway, the point of the slide though is that every year, each of these territories that we saw on the last slide, and I should also mention here that the yellow polygons here show the territories of the family groups of coyotes that we had active radiocollars in. Our impression was that the entire county was saturated with territories like this. So the blank areas on the map here, it's not that there weren't any coyotes living there, it's just that we didn't have them radiocollared. So there were probably, you know, somewhere between 50 and 60 family groups of coyotes living in Prince Edward County at the time we did the work there. And the landscape, again, would have been saturated with these polygons. So each of these family groups will produce 1 litter of pups each year. And most of those pups, as I mentioned, will disperse. If they survive long enough, they'll leave their parents' territory and roam across the landscape looking for a breeding, a territory vacancy and a mate and an opportunity to breed somewhere else. So this animation just shows what that looks like. So here we have now 2 animals, and they'll be joined by a third here. Now we've got 3. These are all pups that have dispersed from the territories they were born into, and now we've got a 4th one, and I think this 4th one remains resident, so it doesn't actually roam. But if you look at the movements of some of these other ones, these 2 over here in particular, you know, what it reminds me of is pinballs, you know, bouncing around inside a pinball machine. Here they've actually found a dead stock pile, and they're spending a fair bit of time feeding on that before they move on. But the real point here is that in a place like Prince Edward County, it doesn't really matter where these pups started or which territory they were born into in the county. During the course of their travels, if they survive long enough, they're going to basically cover the entire county. So, and you can imagine if most of the family groups of coyotes in the county have pups that are doing the same thing, you can imagine that in from fall through winter, there's a huge pulse of dispersing coyote pups that are roaming across the landscape and just looking for opportunities to fill you know, vacancies in the territory mosaic if animals are killed somewhere. And we'll come back to that in a bit, because that's a really important consideration when we talk about you know, attempting to control coyote populations. But in the meantime, we'll talk a little bit about diet. So coyotes are really opportunistic foragers, and I always feel a bit silly, you know, talking about what coyotes will eat in a particular area, because it's actually pretty simple. They'll wherever we're talking about coyotes, basically, if you went out and looked at anything that might be remotely edible on that landscape, then chances are at least some coyotes are eating that, so that they can eat just about anything, and will do so. And doesn't really matter how big it is or how tasty. They have an extremely diverse diet. And the size of coyotes puts them in a very interesting position as well. So this paper by Chris Carbone and colleagues looked at the size of terrestrial carnivores across the globe, and then the size of their main prey. And what they found was that there was sort of a bimodal distribution. So for small predators, typically less than about 21 kilograms, most predators in that size range tend to eat things that are smaller than themselves. Whereas on the larger end of the spectrum, and this is very true for wolves, because of their higher energetic requirements that are sort of mandated by the larger body size, they tend to need large prey and typically hoofed animals to survive. It's just not efficient for a large wolf to feed itself day in, day out, you know, throughout the year on small prey. They would run themselves ragged, trying to hunt that much to get that many rabbits, or certainly that many, small mammals. Coyotes, the eastern coyote in particular, because of the boost in size they got from the inbreeding with wolves that occurred early, when they first colonized Ontario early in the 20th century, they're a little on the low side here, but they live close to the threshold, and this enables them to go both ways. So coyotes can do quite well in the right environment, feeding exclusively on small prey, and we often see that in some parts of southern Ontario. But on the other hand, if in more northern areas, in forested areas, we see coyotes feeding primarily on white-tailed deer, and they're able to adapt and do both quite well. And that brings us to livestock. Now, if you're a coyote living anywhere really in Ontario, the basic math in your head is, how do I get the most calories in my belly with the least amount of effort and the least amount of risk? And unfortunately, often that makes livestock very attractive, because compared to wild prey, livestock are very predictable in space. So you can imagine that those coyotes in Prince Edward County, those territories, would know very well the location of every livestock producer in their territory, and they would know the properties very well, and they would know weaknesses in fences, and they would understand guard animals, so that they know all that. And again, compared to the unpredictability of the wild prey, and particularly larger wild prey that can sometimes defend themselves with hooves and antlers and whatnot, it makes livestock an attractive option. So when we're, and a lot of this is it's easy to say, but in terms of actually putting things into practice, that becomes much more difficult. But the basic idea, if you're trying to prevent livestock predation on your farm, what you're really trying to do is make it either more dangerous or more energetically expensive, more difficult for coyotes to prey on animals on the farm, relative to them going out and just pursuing a wild, free-ranging diet. So just a brief example, this is some work we did with the Ontario Sheep Marketing Agency and grad student Katie Nixon a number of years ago. And we were testing a number of different livestock predation mitigation devices. So through different trials, we were looking at the response of coyotes to various devices that had flashing lights and noises. And in this case, there was a small pasture here with some sheep, and we put flattery, which is just pieces of flagging tape, that blow in the wind, along the fence. And here, and then we set up what we call a virtual fence on the radio collars of the coyotes that we had collared in the area, so that when they came close to this property, suddenly the radio collars they were wearing started taking a fix every 5 minutes. So this gave us a very detailed record of their movements in the immediate area. So this is early in the night, 12:25 a.m. You can see the coyote approaching the fence, and in this case, it came up to the edge, but it didn't enter the paddock, and then turned around and left. A couple days later, another animal came, 4 o'clock in the morning this time, and the same, approached the fence, but left. Something like flattery will work for the short term, but coyotes are very smart and adaptable, and usually within if you're lucky, maybe 3 weeks, they'll figure it out and come to understand that this blowing flagging tape in the wind is really not threatening at all. And indeed, in this case, I think within 3 weeks, these coyotes both entered the paddock, and there were some losses in there. But it definitely initially did provide a short-term repellent. And I think that was sort of the take-home message for most of the scare devices that we looked at. The ones that would scare coyotes, they provided a pretty short-term effect, and coyotes pretty quickly would learn that these things are actually not that threatening, and would figure out a workaround. So this leads us to another part of the work. And if you look at going right back to the beginning of the talk, I showed how coyotes, started out in the Central Plains area, and then responding to landscape changes and changes to the other predator communities that we made, they expanded their range, very extensively across North America. Just about every jurisdiction that first got coyotes, or when coyotes first colonized these jurisdictions, most jurisdictions enacted bounties to try and stop the expansion or population growth of coyotes. And then most of those jurisdictions, in fact, I would say, as far as I know, all of them, eventually abandoned those bounties when they became ineffective, and moved on to other measures. In Ontario, when coyotes first showed up, there had been a long-standing bounty on wolves. When coyotes first showed up in the province in 1919, that bounty was amended to include coyotes as well. And for the first 53 years that coyotes, continued to grow in number and range in Ontario, they did so under a provincial bounty program. So the provincial bounty was scrapped in 1972. Some counties continued to provide financial incentives and a bit of a bounty program, I think well into the 80s, but those, for the most part, were eventually scrapped as well. So as a general observation across coyote range in North America, when you look at intensive control or bounty efforts, you generally see little or no decrease in coyote numbers, regardless of the intensity of the harvest. Oh, and here it says municipalities paid bounties until 1991. But again, during these early colonization periods in Ontario, and despite bounties, coyotes continued to expand in range and number. So this led us to our Prince Edward County coyote research study, and my PhD student, Tyler Wielden, now works on our research team. Tyler did this work as part of his PhD. And the big question there was really, because leading up to this study, we had been hearing reports that there was very high levels of depredation on sheep in Prince Edward County. Coyote numbers were allegedly very high in the county at the time. And we were also hearing that there was very high harvest. And yet, despite very high annual harvests of coyotes in the county, there were still lots of coyotes in the county, and there was still lots of depredation. So we wanted to take a closer look at what was going on there and try and understand how coyotes were able to withstand these high levels of harvest. And so we examined 4 non-exclusive hypotheses that might be accounting for this. And the first is compensatory mortality. So this idea would be that if you increase the rate at which we humans kill coyotes, then all other sort of natural causes would become lower, and the net result would be a fairly similar rate of overall mortality, regardless of whether people were killing coyotes or not. The next potential hypothesis related to reproduction. So compensatory reproduction would posit that you have higher birth rates and juvenile survival rates among exploited populations, largely because when you remove a bunch of coyotes, you would reduce competition for the remaining food, and that would improve the physical condition and the pregnancy rates among the remaining females, and improve their pup survival. Another idea was high abundance. So maybe what was being perceived as a large harvest really wasn't a large harvest, because really a harvest rate, as you know, would be the number of animals harvested, divided by the total population. So even if you have a high number of animals harvested, if the actual population that you're harvesting from is very large, you might only be taking a small portion. So this was a possibility as well, that maybe there was just so many coyotes that what people thought was a high harvest really wasn't very high. And the last idea relates to immigration. Maybe harvests are high, and maybe harvests are temporarily removing many or most coyotes from certain areas. But if there's a large number of floaters in the population that are able to sort of quickly move in, maybe the result is so temporary that it's almost imperceptible. So we ended up monitoring the fates and the movements of 147 radiocollared coyotes in Prince Edward County between 2010 and 2013. And very quickly, we determined that 1, mortality rates were quite high among these coyotes, and 2, that humans were responsible for most of the killing. So we had about 15% of the coyotes that died each year were hit on the roads. Just over 50%, so 52% were shot either by landowners, livestock producers, or hunters. And then we had about 14% that were either trapped or snared each year. And then there was sometimes we wouldn't be able to get to the carcass quick enough, and it would be too decomposed to determine the cause of death. So there was a certain amount of unknown mortality there. But by and large, the vast majority of individuals that were killed, their deaths were somehow linked to people. When we look at the timing of the mortalities throughout the year, there was a couple pulses in the summer, one in early autumn, probably when a lot of the pups are starting to disperse. But by and large, most of the mortality was occurring in the wintertime between the months of December and March when a lot of the harvest was occurring. And if we just look at that a different way and look at so here the survival rate is the probability that if a coyote is alive today, it will still be alive a year from today. So overall, the annual survival rate was about 48%, meaning that you could look at it two ways. One, every coyote that's alive today only has a 48% chance of being alive a year from today, or at the population level, 48% of the coyotes that are alive today expected to still be alive a year from today. And again, survival was pretty high. From this is like the dates from May 1st, so it's, say, the birth of the new litter of pups. Pretty high in the summer, started to drop precipitously in the fall, and then through the winter. Interestingly, we were able to get a large number of carcasses, and what we saw is that most of the coyotes that were dying were young of the year, non-reproductive animals. So and this is important from 2 points of view. One, because they're not part of the breeding population. Many of these animals were non-residents. The ones that were radiocollared, they weren't territory holders. They were animals that were floating around. And we know from other research that these non-resident, certainly juvenile animals, are very unlikely to be instigators of livestock depredation. So many of the coyotes that were being killed each year during the study were animals that were highly unlikely to have been involved in livestock depredation. When we looked at reproductive rates among the females, we saw sort of the full expected range of litter sizes. Most adult females that were killed were pregnant or had showed evidence of reproducing. 14% of yearlings, which was surprising, and surprisingly, even 10% of juveniles. So some coyotes were being bred as pups, and overall, these sort of high reproductive rates and presence of reproduction amongst some animals of young age classes was indicative of a heavily harvested population. So when we combine this, the mortality data, the reproductive data, we can reject that idea that there's just so many coyotes that current levels of harvest were not removing a high proportion, because we demonstrated here clearly that no, we actually were removing a high proportion of the coyote population each year. So we'll go back to space use. So here again is that map showing the breeding territories of some of the resident family groups in the county. I hinted at this earlier, and we showed you that animation. But now picture this map fully saturated with yellow polygons. Those are the territories of the residents. Then on top of that map, you can imagine the movements of all the non-residents so all these young coyotes that are dispersing from their parents' families every fall. And that looks sort of like this mess here. So down in the bottom right in panel D, that shows the movements and sort of living area of just one individual juvenile coyote after it left its parents' territory. So you can see that one animal is covering a huge extent of the county. And when we superimpose the movements of a larger number of these juvenile coyotes on top, you can see you just get a big mess that covers, again, a very large part of the county. Here's a bit of a case study. There was at least 85 coyotes removed during the time we were down there between May 2010 and 2013. At least 85 coyotes removed from this one 200-acre farm. We had a bunch of them radiocollared. Most of the radiocollared animals that were removed from this property were non-residents, so they weren't animals that had been living there. Some of them, you know, a day before they were killed, they were 10 or 15 kilometers away, and 2 or 3 days before they were killed, they might have been 20, 30, 40 kilometers away. So if you're the person living on this farm, there's lots of coyotes around. You're very frustrated. You're losing sheep. You're killing as many coyotes as you can, and yet they just seem to they seem to keep coming. So frustration there on both sides. But I think the lethal removal that was occurring there was doing very little to reduce local coyote densities or to resolve the depredation issues. So if we go back and sort of review our 4 potential hypotheses, the first one was compensatory mortality. We can put a big X by that because most of the mortality that was occurring was related to people, and so there was very little natural mortality occurring anyway, so there wasn't much natural mortality to compensate there. Compensatory reproduction, maybe a little bit, like we saw some evidence of reproduction by young animals. Litter sizes were relatively consistent with what we'd expect from the literature, but a high overall. So probably not a major contributor, but there was some evidence that compensatory reproduction might have been occurring. High abundance, we can say no, because again, the annual survival rates were low, and we know that the harvest that was occurring was removing a large portion of the coyote population every year. So that leaves us with the immigration, and I think that's the most likely scenario, is that there was enough pups being born in enough territories across the county every year that no matter what happened to coyotes from their neighboring groups, there was always a pool of young dispersing animals roaming around the landscape that were sort of quickly able to fill those voids. And so I think that's the thing with lethal control. The only way that it could really be effective, and the only way a bounty could really be effective, regardless of any other considerations, would be if you had full access to all properties across a very large area, because it doesn't take many territories to produce enough pups to repopulate and compensate for harvest in surrounding areas. So coming back then to try and prevent depredation on your farm, non-lethal deterrents, can repel coyotes, but they mostly, for the most part, they have a short-term effect. So you got to be very strategic when you use them. If you leave stuff up all year round, by the time you really need it, say during lambing season, the coyotes are probably going to be very used to it, and will freely pass by those devices. Much depredation is attributable to breeding males, and this is not work that we did here in Ontario, but a lot of research that has been done in the West points to breeding males, points to adults that are provisioning pups, and in particular breeding males, as being the primary component of the coyote population that's responsible for livestock depredation. So if you are experiencing losses and you're sort of at your wit's end, you've tried the available non-lethal deterrents and are still having problems, and you're going to resort to lethal removal of coyotes, timing is really important, because if you remove a breeding coyote or breeding coyotes too early, they're almost certainly going to be replaced by the time the next lambing season rolls around. If you are going to do this, research shows that selective culling within breeding territories and using things like wounded animal calls can be effective at attracting and taking breeding males. The other point that I would, and this is the last bullet here, we certainly recommend trapping and removing problem coyotes only, and using highly trained trappers. And there's a couple things to consider here. One, coyotes are very smart and hard to trap. So if you're going to have someone trap coyotes, they need to be good at it. If you have someone who doesn't really know what they're doing, or if you try it yourself and you don't really know what you're doing, and you educate those coyotes, you're going to make it very, very, very difficult for anyone to ever catch them in the future. And also, not all coyotes are involved in livestock depredation. And in fact, there are thankfully lots of producers that are able to you know, run their operations and have very minimal or sometimes no problems with coyote predation. And if you're lucky enough to be one of those people, the best advice that I could give would be to leave well enough alone, because coyotes have a lot of individual differences in behavior. And if you have coyotes living on or around your property and they're not bothering the livestock, you want to keep those coyotes intact and in place, because if they do die and are replaced by other coyotes, the new coyotes that replace them might, you know, have a very different attitude and might, you know, quickly become a problem for your livestock. So if it isn't broken, don't try and fix it. If you're not having problems, it's definitely good advice to try and do what you can to keep those current resident coyotes there and healthy. So if we're not able to control coyote abundance, you know, through top-down measures, through harvest, what does control coyote abundance? And the answer seems to be prey biomass. And we see this with wolves as well. And here's a figure from the Coyote coyote study up in the Yukon, but each number here represents a year. On the horizontal axis here, you've got the number of snowshoe hares per 100 hectares in the previous winter. On the vertical axis, we've got the number of coyotes per 100 square kilometers, and you can see a very tight relationship here. As from 87 to 88, 89, 90, as snowshoe hare numbers increased, there was a very predictable and tight increase in coyote numbers the following year. And then between 90 and 91 and 92, as snowshoe hare numbers started to crash, 1 year later, coyote numbers declined quite sharply following that. So coyote numbers are really governed by the amount of food out on the landscape. We don't, so as part of some of our research studies in the province, you know, we measured coyote abundance in, you know, in particular study areas, but as a general rule, we don't measure absolute abundance of coyotes, you know, across broad areas of the province. But we do index the number of wolves or coyotes seen in WMUs by hunters during both the deer and moose season. And when we look at that index broadly across the province, and we see that there was quite a marked increase in coyote abundance during the early 2000s. Numbers peaked between, say, 2009 and 10, and around that range across much of southern and central Ontario. And then through much of the 2010s, you know, numbers were fairly steady. We saw a slight increase, sorry, from 2015 up through about 2019. And then over the last couple of falls, coyote numbers have either dropped slightly or remained steady. But compared to the decade of the 2000s, when coyote numbers really seemed to increase from low numbers up to a peak around 2009, you know, the last decade or a little more has shown fairly stable coyote numbers across much of southern region. So I know we're getting a little tight on time here. So I had a few slides on urban coyotes. I'm gonna rush through them really quick and then wrap up. Coyotes occupy all urban spaces that we're aware of. You know, in I was going to say North America, and that's true, but certainly in Ontario. And in urban spaces, coyotes really prefer green spaces. So here you can see the dots are the locations of radiocollared coyote, and in this residential area, and you can see that the coyote has spent most of its time in this green space, you know, behind these houses and behind these other buildings. Because they like green spaces, golf courses provide tremendous habitat for coyotes in urban areas. And you can see here, these coyotes spent most of their time on these golf courses or in Marie Curtis Park. And another surprising thing that might surprise some of you is that you would think an urban area would present a lot more barriers to movement, you know, and often they probably do. But we've got several examples of radiocollared coyotes making very extensive movements, you know, through highly developed urban areas in southern Ontario. So here we have a coyote that was trapped on a Hydro 1 property just south of Pearson Airport in October of 2013. It stayed there for a couple months, and in December it started its dispersal. And you can see that it worked its way south and then over towards Niagara Falls and ended, I think the radiocollar actually dropped or fell off the coyote in May, but way down south of Niagara Falls. So very extensive movement there. This past year we had the autumn 2020, we had a coyote start in the west end of Toronto and make its way all the way over to Prince Edward County. And it ended up getting killed on the east end of Edward County in December 2020. But it probably followed the GO train line and along Lake Ontario there. But again, a very extensive movement out of the urban matrix of Toronto. So when we go back to the beginning too, when I talked about from a genetic point of view, we don't see much population structuring among coyotes. You know, these are examples of why, because they're so mobile that you know, it's very hard to it would be very hard to have a restricted coyote population, you know, within the province. So here's an unusual movement that we observed quite a few years ago. But here we had a 3-week period in September, and in 3 weeks, this coyote never left this small green space, you know, behind these houses. And looks like a baseball diamond here. In the wild, whether it's an agricultural landscape or in the forest, you would never see a coyote or a wolf spend, you know, that much time in such a small area without changing out water. And so we thought this and thought there has to be a food source here, otherwise there's no way they could do this. And when we went in and investigated that green space, there was just a lot of garbage in there, and so the coyote was feeding on garbage. So this is a clear case where human food subsidies, even if unintentional, were increasing the carrying capacity for coyotes, increasing the occupancy of these small patches of space that would otherwise support fewer coyotes for less time. And so the longer you have more coyotes in an area like that, the greater the chance there is for conflict, you know, with people or pets. So human food subsidies in a case like this really were increasing the chance of a negative encounter between coyotes and people or coyotes and pets. So the simple message there for municipalities is that keeping green spaces clean will mean fewer coyotes and less conflict. So I'm going to wrap things up, and I just wanted to comment real briefly on coyotes as a threat to human safety. You know, over the last 10 or 20 years, you know, there's been a few times when there's been letter writing campaigns into the papers, or people sort of make launch a bit of a personal campaign where they're trying to raise awareness that coyotes are very dangerous, and you know, that the government should be doing more to remove all coyotes, or as many coyotes as possible, to protect people. But we need to put that into context. So there have been 2 confirmed human fatalities to coyotes in North America in modern times. But by comparison, between 1983 and 2017, there was 43 deaths in Canada from domestic dogs. And, you know, in Ontario, we don't like to think about this, but we average about 1 shooting a day, and 23 to 25 deaths due to shootings in the province every year. And in the first 6 months of 2020, we had 54 pedestrians and 9 cyclists either killed or seriously injured by drivers just in the city of Toronto alone. So there are a lot of things out there that are dangerous. Coyotes are predators. They hunt with their teeth, so they have to be respected as a potentially dangerous animal. But there are many things out there that we sort of willingly expose ourselves to on a daily basis, you know, that are much more dangerous than coyotes. So the fear of an animal like a coyote typically exceeds the actual risk. And the risk of attack by a coyote is very low relative to other common hazards. Nonetheless, it's important to adhere to best practices. And I didn't get into this in much detail, but whether you're on a farm or in an urban area, removing attractants, so removing, you know, any potential sources of food, you know, whether that's garbage or pet food, keeping things clean to avoid attracting and allowing coyotes to become food conditioned will go a long way towards reducing potential conflict. So I'm going to sum it all up in one slide. Coyotes are here to stay. They're not inherently bad. They're not inherently good. They're just a wild animal that's trying to survive and reproduce like all other wild animals. Changes that we've made to the landscape, you know, have made conditions very good for coyotes across much of Ontario, and certainly human changes facilitated the massive range expansion by coyotes. And because of this broad distribution that coyotes have, you know, virtually every jurisdiction in North America has to find ways to coexist and adapt to live with coyotes. And many jurisdictions have poured a lot of time and effort into doing that, and many jurisdictions have found successful strategies for reducing conflict with coyotes and coexisting. So coyotes are here to stay. It's in everybody's best interest to learn as much as you can about these animals. We can decrease contact with coyotes by removing potential sources of food for them. There are things that can be done to help prevent losses to livestock losses, and lethal control sometimes becomes an option that some producers might feel is necessary. If you're going to do that, I would say attempt it when and where necessary and try and be sort of surgical and strategic and very focused rather than sort of broad in that effort. More information on managing and preventing conflict can be found at the government's website, and the Ministry of Agri-Foods, the AMAFRA website, will have additional information on preventing conflict and livestock losses as well. So I thank you again for the opportunity to be here to speak to you today, and if we have a few minutes, I'd be very happy to answer some questions. So thank you.